Week 6 of the NFL season is officially in the books, and with that has come many question marks surrounding many of the NFL's top head coaches. So in today's video, I want to do a hot seat tier list for every single coach in the NFL. So as I mentioned, we are going to be doing a hot seat tier list for every single coach. And as you can see, this is going to be our tier list. Our tiers in this video are going to be lock, safe unless something catastrophic happens, questions but still pretty safe, starting to boil, and then full on boiling. You guys can interpret this your own way. Boiling obviously means that you're on the hot seat. Lock means you're pretty damn safe. But with that all being said, if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. But let's go ahead and hop into it. We are going to begin with Raheem Morris of the Atlanta Falcons, and I feel like this one is pretty safe to say that he's pretty darn safe unless something completely catastrophic were to happen. So far for this season for the Atlanta Falcons, they've been playing some pretty good ball, and I think thus far Raheem Morris has done a pretty fine job both offensively and defensively, so I feel like he's pretty safe. Then we have Sean McVay. He's one of the NFL's best head coaches, but this Rams team is just not playing good football. With that being said though, I don't think that it's really his fault. I'm going to put him in there at lock. I know the team is playing bad, but Sean McVay is a hell of a coach, and a lot of people really like Sean McVay, so I think barring this team losing every single game, which is just not going to happen, he's pretty damn safe, barring retirement or anything like that. Next up, we have Mike McDaniel of the Miami Dolphins. If you had asked me this before the season, I would say he's probably at a lock, but right now I actually think there's some questions, but he's probably still pretty safe. Obviously, the Tua Tagovailoa concussion issues is something that he simply cannot prevent, but with that said, it is hurting his reputation, and he has not been doing a good job of coaching this team in the absence of Tua Tagovailoa, so I do think there are some questions, but I think for the most part, he's pretty safe. Next up, we have Dave Canales of the Carolina Panthers. This one is interesting because he is a first-year head coach, and obviously he was a really highly touted prospect of a coach coming into last offseason. But so far, the season hasn't really gone the way that the Carolina Panthers would like it to go. I still feel like he's pretty safe, barring any sort of major catastrophe, but I don't really know what that catastrophic event could be, so I'm just going to put him there. But I think it would take him to lose like every single game in humiliating fashion the rest of the way for him to get his job taken away from him, but I think he's pretty darn safe. Next up, Gerard Mayo of the New England Patriots. I kind of have the same vibe with Gerard Mayo and Dave Canales, both first-year head coaches, both dealing with some offensive issues, and both guys will get plenty of more opportunities. I feel like the only way that he's going to lose his job is if he completely blunders Drake May and the rest of this season with that team. So with that said, I think he's pretty darn safe. Next is Andy Reid. I feel like I don't even have to explain this one. He is arguably the best head coach in the NFL. His job is really freaking safe. Next up is Antonio Pierce of the Las Vegas Raiders, and I'm going to say it, I think he's on the hot seat, man. This team has just not been playing good. He didn't have a very long leash coming into this season because, you know, he was an interim head coach last year. I don't think many fans thought he was going to be a savior of a head coach. I like Antonio Pierce, but that team is playing some really bad football, both offensively and defensively, and I just don't know if he's the right guy for the job. We'll have to wait and see. Obviously, I think he's still going to be the head coach next year, but I do think that hot seat is definitely starting to boil. Next up, we have Brian Callahan of the Tennessee Titans. I think he's generally pretty safe, but I will say I do think it's starting to boil because of what's going on with Will Levis and this team in totality. The offensive line isn't playing very good, but the quarterback play might be even worse. I still think he's going to get plenty more time to prove himself, but I do think the seat is starting to boil a tad bit. It's not full on boiling like some of these other coaches, but I think that it's starting to get there. Again, I don't think he's going to lose his job. Next up, Mike McDonald for the Seattle Seahawks. I think he's generally pretty safe, but I will say I do think there are a couple questions. Thus far, the offensive line has looked atrocious for the Seattle Seahawks, and his defense that he's become really touted and known for hasn't really played that much good football. Yes, they have some injuries, and yes, they are at a talent deficit, but I think there are some questions, but I generally think he's pretty safe. Next up, Dan Campbell of the Detroit Lions. He's one of the NFL's best head coaches. That team absolutely loves him. They just whooped the Dallas Cowboys, so his job is pretty safe. Next up, we have Mike Tomlin of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I kind of feel like he's pretty darn safe. I know that Steelers fans are constantly asking for his job, but he's one of those head coaches that has been on the team for many years. Fans love him. The team love him. So I think barring this team just having a terrible end to the season, maybe with this Russell Wilson news coming out that he's the starting quarterback, this could potentially start to boil up that process, but because I don't think it will, I'm going to put him at safe unless something catastrophic were to happen. That catastrophic event would probably be like losing a lot of the big games later in the season and missing the playoffs. Next up, Doug Peterson. I don't think there's a head coach with a more boiling hot seat right now than Doug Peterson. I mean, he is just completely lost that team. That team just does not fight for him. That team just does not care anymore. And when you've blundered away the team culture, the quarterback, and all these other talented position groups, yeah, you're going to be on the hot seat. I think of all the head coaches I'm talking about in this video, I think Doug Peterson has the highest chance of being fired within the next couple weeks, more so than any other coach. Next up, we have a Harbaugh for the Baltimore Ravens. I feel pretty safe to say that he is a lock. That Ravens team is humming, it's going, and even if this team has some sort of injury that causes them to miss the playoffs, which I don't think is going to happen, nor do I hope happens, I still feel like this team is pretty safe. Harbaugh is, again, somebody who's been on that team for many years, so it's not like this team is going to put him on a short leash. He's going to have a very long leash, and I think he's going to be there for many more years to come. Next up, Dan Quinn of the Washington Commanders. I feel pretty safe to say that he's a lock at this point. No, I don't think he's as good of a coach as those other coaches, but thus far, the team is 4-2, and this team had very low expectations, at least in the grand scheme of the media. Dan Quinn has done a hell of a job, and I think he's pretty safe moving forward. Even if this team were to start losing a couple more games and potentially missing the playoffs, I think that's totally fine for Dan Quinn. I feel like this team is already overperforming and has already shown so much that I feel like he's pretty safe, at least from where I see it right now. Next up, Brian Daboll. I feel really bad for Daboll, but I'm going to have to put him in starting to boil. This is a coach who, in my opinion, is a really solid head coach, but the issue is this team just does not have the talent to compete with a lot of other coaches. And for this Giants team, I kind of feel like eventually they're going to want to make a major move to sort of signify that what's been going on these past couple years just isn't okay. And I think that move that could potentially happen to make that signal and to tell everyone that this team has to lock in and start winning might be by firing Brian Daboll. Again, I don't think he's going to get fired. I'd be kind of shocked if he did, but at the same time, this team has been pretty bad the past couple years. They're 2-4 to start out this season, and Daboll's offense just hasn't looked very good. Granted, you have Daniel Jones, you're without Malik Neighbors, so I think we'll have to wait and see, but I wouldn't be too shocked if he got fired within the next couple weeks or even months. Next up, Sean Payton of the Denver Broncos. I feel like there are some question marks, but I feel like for the most part, he's generally pretty safe. The Broncos have been playing some pretty solid football, and given the fact that a lot of people thought this Broncos team was going to be outright horrible, this team has actually done some pretty good things. They have some pretty impressive victories, but they've also had a couple games where they didn't play terribly well. I think this team is going to finish somewhere with like an 8-9, 7-10 record, which I think for this Broncos team with a young quarterback and a pretty untalented team, that's a pretty good look for Sean Payton, at least in my opinion. So barring this team having a catastrophic ending and barring some of these questions not being answered, then I think he might lose his job, but I would be very shocked if that happened. Next up, D'Amico Ryans, the Houston Texans. This is a lock. He is a fantastic head coach, was a great coach for this team last year, and so far this year, the Texans have not skipped a beat. They're one of the league's best teams, and D'Amico Ryans is one of the best coaches out there, so yeah, he's pretty darn safe. Next up, Matt Eberflus of the Chicago Bears. Now, if you had asked me this question maybe 2 weeks ago, I would have said that he was probably in starting to boil, but I feel like he's done a really solid job these past couple weeks, so I'm just going to move him up one spot into questions, but still pretty safe, because this Bears team looks like it's starting to find its groove. Caleb Williams is playing better. Granted, they've been going up against some bad teams, so we'll have to wait and see how this team performs, but at least as of when I'm making this video, they're 4-2, have some pretty good victories. The offense is starting to look better, so I think there's still a couple questions that need to be answered later in the season, but if this Bears team can answer some of those questions, then I think he's generally pretty safe. Next up, Shane Steichen of the Indianapolis Colts. This season hasn't really gone their way, but I still feel like Shane Steichen is still a really solid head coach, so I'm going to put him in safe unless something catastrophic were to happen. I think that catastrophic event would be like this team just losing the majority of their games later in the season. This Colts team is competitive. They might make the playoffs, and because I think that this team is going to continue to play better once these guys get healthy, I think that he's generally pretty safe. But again, if this team were to have something catastrophic happen, I could see a world where he maybe could be pushed down this list and maybe become a bit of a hotter seat head coach. Next up, Mike McCarthy. 4 straight home games with the Dallas Cowboys have been blown out and flat out embarrassed. I don't know how that's going to sit with Jerry Jones. Jerry, it does not seem like he's going to fire him mid-season, which I feel like does make some sense, but at the same time, his contract, I believe, is up at the end of this year, so I don't think he's going to be back for this team next year. So yeah, he's on the hot seat. He's boiling hot right now. Next up, Jonathan Gannon of the Arizona Cardinals. Last year, the team did decent, given the fact that this team was clearly at a talent deficit. They did not have the quarterback of the future, and this team had a lot of issues. So coming into this year, the expectation was to be a more competitive team and to be a better team. And I feel like they are. They're definitely more competitive. I think Kyler Murray's having a pretty fine season, but this team just isn't where I would imagine the fan base wants it to be. With that said, I don't think he's boiling, and I also don't really feel like he's in the middle of this tier list. I don't really know where to put Gannon, so I'm going to put him at like the top of starting to boil, because I don't think he's going to lose his job anytime soon, because I feel like they're going to give him at least one more year with a more talented team to prove himself. But Jonathan Gannon's defense has not looked good. This Cardinals team is clearly at a talent deficit, so I don't know. I think it's generally a bit of a question mark, but I don't think he will lose his job. I just don't really know where to put him, to be honest with you. Next up, Todd Bowles of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I feel like he is generally pretty safe. Unless this team is to like lose out, somehow miss the playoffs, or just have a really bad end to the season, then yeah, he might get fired. He might be sort of the repercussions of not making the playoffs. But because I feel like they're pretty much almost a lock to make the playoffs, I feel like he's generally pretty safe. Next up, Kevin Stefanski of the Cleveland Browns. Listen, there's a lot of things going wrong with the Cleveland Browns, and I think Kevin Stefanski is a hell of a head coach. So even if he were to get fired, I think he'd get picked up by another team pretty quickly. The issue for Kevin Stefanski is that he continues to defend Deshaun Watson and continues to say that he is the future head coach or future quarterback of this team, which clearly just is not going to happen. So I definitely think that this seat is starting to get hot. Is it flat out boiling? I wouldn't say so. This guy has obviously won Coach of the Year last year, had a great year last year, is not having a good year this year. So I think it's starting to boil, but it's definitely getting close to flat out boiling, especially if they don't make a quarterback change in the next couple weeks. Next up, Kevin O'Connell. Listen, you're undefeated. You have Sam Darnold as your starting quarterback, and you're making him look like an MVP. Yeah, you're a lock. Next up, Matt LaFleur, Green Bay Packers. Same sort of vibe here. I think that he's pretty darn safe. This is a guy who's been on the team for many years at this point, has been a very successful head coach, is a great offensive mind, and I think Packers fans generally like the guy. I think that he's done a good job with Jordan Love. I would say that he's pretty safe. Even if this team were to somehow miss the playoffs, I feel like he would definitely get another opportunity next year and years beyond, but this Packers team is really good. They're not going to miss the playoffs. They're going to be a team that is in the competition for a Super Bowl. So yeah, he's pretty safe. Next up, Nick Sirianni of the Philadelphia Eagles. Yeah, I'm going to put him in boiling, man. This team has not looked good so far this year. Yes, they're 3-2, but dude, you beat the Cleveland Browns by 4 points. And you're going out there and talking mess to the fans. I mean, that was a terrible look for Nick Sirianni. He was coming into this season already on the hot seat, and I don't think he's done much to improve that look. He's definitely on the hot seat. Next up, Dennis Allen of the New Orleans Saints. If you had asked me this after week 2, he would probably be somewhere up here, but because this team has looked atrocious the past couple weeks, granted, some injuries have hurt this team, interior offensive line, some defensive players. Chris Olave just missed all of last week, and then of course your quarterback's out. So I don't think he's going to lose his job, but I do believe it's potentially starting to boil at this point. This is a Saints team that isn't necessarily rebuilding. They're in the process of trying to actively make the playoffs, and they're not looking terribly good at this point. They've had a couple contests that were close, and they've had a couple good victories, but since that week 2 game, they haven't won a game and have not looked like the same team. And I think a lot of that blame will be put on Dennis Allen, because it probably should be at this point. Next is Sean McDermott of the Buffalo Bills. I'm going to put him at questions, but still generally pretty safe. I feel like Bills fans want to get rid of this guy, and I can definitely understand, but I think Sean McDermott is a solid enough defensive coach, and because this offense is still pretty good, and because I think Josh Allen can carry this team to a playoff spot, I feel like he's generally pretty safe. But if for some reason this team were to look ugly later in the season, maybe even miss the playoffs or even be a first round exit, I think he might have some question marks regarding his safety for his position, but I feel like he's generally okay for right now. Next up, Harbaugh and the Chargers. I think that he is pretty darn good. Listen, he's a first-year head coach. He's got a lot of hype, a lot of anticipation, and so far that Chargers team has looked really solid. Defensively, by the way, the Chargers are looking fantastic. So yeah, I think Harbaugh's pretty safe. Next up, Kyle Shanahan of the San Francisco 49ers. I feel like some question marks are starting to come up for this team. I'm going to put him in questions, but still generally pretty safe. Listen, this guy has led teams to Super Bowls, has not gotten the job done all the way, but man, there's not a lot of head coaches that can say that they've made a Super Bowl run. And for Kyle Shanahan, he can say that. The issue for Kyle is that he just can't get the job done. And I feel like Niners fans are getting a little bit sick of it. And these past couple weeks have not been pretty for the 49ers. They have not looked good. They're currently sitting at 3-3. And while the team has looked better the past couple weeks, they just dominated the Seattle Seahawks. This is a team that is expected to be one of the best teams out there. And so far they haven't looked at that. So I think unless this team were to somehow miss the playoffs or not win the division or maybe be a first or second round exit, then I feel like he's safe. But if one of those things were to happen, then I do think that there is the possibility possibility of potentially being fired. And then the last head coach of this video, obviously Robert Saleh just got fired, so yeah, you can go ahead and just put him on boiling. He's already at home. Is Zach Taylor of the Cincinnati Bengals, and I think this one is definitely starting to boil. This was a Bengals team that coming into the season had Super Bowl expectations, had Super Bowl hype. Hell, I had them making a deep playoff run, and so far they've only won 2 games and they haven't looked good against any good teams. And I think a big reason for that is Zach Taylor. Obviously, the offense has looked pretty good, but whenever you're the head coach, you're going to get blamed for things that even maybe aren't in your control. And I think Zach Taylor does have to hone a bit of the blame here. I think he hasn't done a fantastic job, but I don't think he's done a terrible job. With that said, though, somebody will get the blame if this team were to miss the playoffs, and I think that he would be the guy who gets the blame. But you guys let me know in the comment section below, what do you guys think of my head coach hot seat tier list? And if you guys enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.